I'm going to use the main light to try to stay still.
It's really beautiful screen.
It is, isn't it?
Incredible.
It's like, it's almost too bright. Like we have to put the brightness down on it because
Really?
if I want it, just
Yeah.
like,
Oh my God. Is there a big surge?
no, I think I'll snap out here. I think that the next place for improvement is so much more investment with better cameras, but you have the sound in it.
Yeah. Yeah, I've seen some pretty low cost organizations
That's
bring out pretty amazing stuff.
I know, yeah. But they have those ones that follow people around the room now.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. Henry and I gave a presentation on George Mason earlier.
Oh, yeah, how'd that go?
Yeah, I'm happy to tell you more about that.
Yeah, no, I'd love to. And Jim, Jim said that shot in the proclamation line at the second. Hey, Richard, you're meeting with Henry after this? Are you being Henry? Leslie.
Oh, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming out on this Friday, this rainy Friday, but I think there's no better place to be than indoors. So, and we're really excited for what I think is the first map chat of 2024. We hope to continue this conversation throughout the summer, but especially the fall. And so in a moment, I'm going to introduce Alexandra Montgomery, who I'm sure many of you are now familiar with, given all the talks that she's done and what she works on here. But I just want to bring a few events, put them on your radar screen. The first is next week on May the 15th. We have a lunch at the library with Brooke Manville, who is a scholar who became an entrepreneur and a successful businessman, who then returned to his scholarship after his career in the business world. And he's published a book that analyzes all the democracies that have happened from the ancient period to today to figure out what are the elements that help them thrive and what are the threats that often bring about their demise. And his book is The Civic Bargain, How Democracy Survives. And so that's May the 15th, next week, lunch at the library. Those are the lunches where if you purchase a ticket, we'll provide lunch and some good conversation. Our next evening book talk is May the 23rd, and that is How the Best Did It, Leadership Lessons from Our Top Presidents by Talmage Boston. And I'll give you a little bit of a inside peek at it. One of the best presidents is George Washington. And he'll be in conversation with Lindsay Chervinsky, a presidential historian. Then from May the 31st to June the 2nd, we're hosting our international symposium called the Mount Vernon Symposium, which we host every May. This one is called On the Eve of Independence, Art and Architecture in the British Empire. And this is coinciding with, it is 2024, 250 years ago in 1774. There was a lot happening in the world. There was a lot happening in colonial America, but there's also a lot that's happening here at Mount Vernon. That's the year that George Washington began the great expansion of the mansion. The modern mansion we see today really was constructed during this expansion that began in 1774. So we're using that anniversary to organize this conference that's going to look at the art and architecture that's happening throughout the British Empire, just on the cusp of American independence. And then finally, our next brown bag is June the 7th. That is going to be, again, Alla giving another map chat. So please mark that on your calendar. So today, Dr. Montgomery is going to be talking about the Hutchins map of 1778. For those of you that have been tuning in or attending these lectures, this is in some ways a return, an expansion, and improvement on a map that you talked about earlier, the Lewis Evans map. It is done by Hutchins, who was the first, and I learned from Alla, I knew he was the first geographer of the United States. I was not fully aware that he was also the only geographer of the United States.
He was simply too good.
Yeah. But this is a map that is looking at the western area. It's a map that that Washington referred to throughout. It was done in 1778, so probably during the war period, but also when he returned to Mount Vernon and was thinking about the future of America, which he realized was in the West. This was a map that he was using to think about grand strategy for the country, both as a private citizen here in Mount Vernon, but then later as president of the United States. So with that, all looking forward to what you want to share with us.
Thank you so much for that, Patrick. I think you did spoil some of my story beats here, but that's completely fine. I'll allow it. Let me get the thing here. So yes, as Dr. Sparrow mentioned, today we're going to be talking about the Thomas Hutchins map of the West. This map was published in 1778, but a lot of the story I'm going to tell, we're kind of going to range across time, but a lot of the story I'm going to be telling involves more of this interwar period. And that's going to be the theme for the talks about maps that I'll be giving this year, is thinking about mapping during the Imperial crisis between the 7 Years' War, when the British and the French clashed. The French were kicked out of North America, and then the American Revolution, which hopefully everyone in this room knows a little something about. If not, we have a lot of resources. So for the next four talks, I'm going to be talking about what's happening in this in-between period. Although, as we'll see, we're sort of range back and forth a little bit. But first, I want to shout out the reason for giving these talks, other than the fact that I think they're cool, is to celebrate argomaps.org. So ARGO stands for American Revolutionary Geographies Online. It is a multi-institutional map platform project that we are spearheading here at the Washington Library alongside our friends at the Leventhal Center in Boston. They're associated with the Boston Public Library. And this is a platform that brings together maps of North America made between 1740 and 1800 on a lot of different scales and a lot of different definitions. We've got views, we've got naval charts, we've got manuscripts, we've got published maps, all available for you from 16 different institutions. There are 24 in the consortium, well over 3,000 maps right now. So if you are a map fan, please check it out. And if you are here in person, if you look on your table, you will see stickers and magnets. Oprah-like, you get a sticker and you get a sticker. We all get stickers. argomaps.org. So I just wanted to shout that out right at the top, that the reason for these is to talk more about ARGO, encourage the use of ARGO, as well as show off our wonderful collections here, many of which, including the map we're talking about today, were donated by the wonderful Richard H. Brown, who is sitting in the front row today. Hi, Richard. Sorry. All right. So first, though, at the top, and I did this with my previous talk, so just a show of hands, who in the room attended or listened to any of my previous talks about maps from last year? Okay, so probably about a third of the room, which is pretty decent. That's fine. Those are all available if you like this and you want to learn more. Some of this might be a little repetitive for those of you who listened to my earlier talks, but it also, I think, will hopefully just be a good refresher for those of you who did. So one of the things I want to talk about and make sure we're all clear about in the room before we get started, which is part of why the Washington Library is involved in ARGO in the first place, is the fact that George Washington was a map guy. I have very few things in common with George Washington, but one of them is I think we both really are interested in maps and think about the world through maps spatially. As some evidence of my assertion that George Washington was a map guy, George Washington was involved in various types of mapping throughout his life. So his first sort of job when he's young, starting at age 16, is as a surveyor. He does surveys of a lot of the Fairfax land out in sort of Western Virginia. This is one of his surveys here from our collections. But even when he stops being a professional surveyor, he's only a professional surveyor for a little over 2 years. Even after that, he's still making maps. He's making maps up until practically the day he dies. So he keeps those tools active. They're very important to him for understanding his lands, for understanding the military, and for understanding the nation that he comes to have such an important part in. Washington also collected the maps that other people made. It was important to him to have access to a significant map library. So this is just one example here from the Washington Financial Papers, which is just a very nice direct one where he's buying a map. This is the John Henry map of Virginia. And he purchased a large number of maps during his life, to the extent that when he died, in his probate inventory, we have records for over 57 maps and charts and that is beside all of the atlases, which he also had, which is a significant map collection, I think, both today and certainly in the 18th century. That is nothing to sneeze at. That is a very significant map collection. And as you will see, if you are eagle-eyed, or if you wait until I click to the next slide, included in his collection was the Hutchins map. So this is a map, as Dr. Sparrow mentioned, that we know Washington used. He talked about using it. A little bit later in the talk, I'll get into some of the specifics of how Washington used the Hutchins map. But this map in particular was very important for him as he was imagining, understanding, trying to learn more about the West, particularly in the post-revolutionary period, but the pre-revolutionary period as well. Okay. So mapping the new North America, this is kind of my guiding theme here. And we're gonna have to rewind a little bit to talk about what I mean by new North America. But first off, here's the map itself. So for those of you who are here in person, you will have the chance to see the original map in the next room. So after the talk, when you exit, there's a room to the right. And we have our copy of the Hutchins map from the Brown collection pulled out, as well as the French edition of the map and the accompanying pamphlet, all of which you will hear about today. If you're joining us online, we should have a link available to look at this at ARGO. And certainly either way, if you want to take some time, zoom in on the details, spend some time with the map, ARGO is a great place to explore this map. But this is basically what it looks like. This is the map we're talking about today. The full title is A New Map of the Western Parts of Virginia, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and North Carolina, comprehending the River Ohio and all the rivers which fall into it. Part of the River Mississippi, the whole of the Illinois River, Lake Erie, and part of the lakes Huron, Michigan, etc., and all the country bordering on those lakes and rivers. Catchy title, as usual. We're going to call it the Hutchins map. It's easier. All right, but let's rewind. Let's rewind and see why is this map important? What do I mean by new North America? How can we understand this map in its proper context? So last year, I gave a series of 3 talks about important maps from the 1750s. So very much pre-American Revolution, even pre-7 Years' War. The 3 maps I looked at we're going to recap them in a second, the Fry-Jefferson map, the Evans map, and the Mitchell map. And these maps were really reflecting this moment of heightened tension between the British and French empires. So up here we have a map of the 7 Years' War, also known as the French and Indian War, which shows generally where empires were, where the European empires were in North America, and perhaps most importantly, the areas where they sort of disagreed with one another about where each should be. You'll see that let's see if I can get this thing to work here. Here we go. Yeah, you'll see that the relevant areas are sort of up through this area that they often refer to as the back country, and then also sort of up north into what's now Canada. So accordingly, when we look at these maps that were important, that were produced prior to this war, they focus on that area. So the Fry-Jefferson map is of Virginia, but it's distinctive because it is one of the first maps, if not the first good map of Virginia, that really focuses on this interior area as opposed to just the Chesapeake Bay adjacent area. It's really interested in the interior western parts of the colony. The Evans map, which Dr. Sparrow mentioned at the top, is sort of the most important early map of what is called the Ohio country, which is a very confusing phrase because it's not just the state of Ohio. It's like the state of Ohio plus. It's super Ohio, ultra Ohio, if you will. And so we will return to this map. And then finally, the Mitchell map, which is the sort of de facto standard map of North America from this period. This is considered to be the finest map of all of North America, but which still is very clearly created in this moment of tension between the French and the British. So to sum that up, I've sort of circled in gray here the area that's getting the most attention from maps during these years. But what happens after the 7 Years' War is that area of attention shifts to this area. Does anyone in the audience want to take a stab as to why? The hint is, what happens at the end of the 7 Years' War? Speak up. We kicked the French out. Yes. Exactly. Deb is correct. We kick out the French. And by we, I mean the British Empire, and I was not there for that, so I can't actually take any credit for that. All of that area that is blue on this map, as well as Florida, which is shown as claimed by the Spanish here, becomes British. So basically, it's like you're taking a paint bucket and you're filling in this entire area red. in terms of the imperial claims of these places, which drastically changes the balance of power. So here's two maps side by side just to show that. So we go from this area of contention, there's disagreement about who controls what. And again, I want to emphasize this is just the European imperial powers. Indigenous people had a very different perspective on all of this. And it goes from that kind of not a free-for-all, but certainly a lot of tension, a lot of competing claims and power bases to a situation where all of a sudden it's pretty much just the British in all of Eastern North America. So as a result of this, and I'm not going to dwell too long on this, what you get is a large number of surveying and mapping expeditions that are being sent out by the British in a very official capacity. So these are things that are being done by the British military. They're things that are being commissioned by the British Parliament to map all of these places that had once been claimed by the French and are now claimed by the British. And I like this one. I think later in this series, we're going to talk a little bit about what's going on in the North and the South. And this is from a book that's more about that. But the relevant bit here is what's going on in the middle. And you will see a name which I hope is already familiar. That's our boy, Thomas Hutchins, right there in the middle. Because it's not just the coastal areas, it is also this new expanded interior that the British all of a sudden feel that they have access to that is now part of their claims. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about the Wild West, by which, of course, I mean Ohio. Pause for laughter, thank you. And that is the thing to remember, that when people in the 18th century are talking about the West, what they mean is what we think of today as like the Midwest. We are not in the Rocky Mountains. We are very much still exploring and in many ways not at all in control of this area in between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi. So this Midwestern area. So that's what we mean by when we say the West in the 18th century. So as I've already mentioned, mapping the area, the Ohio country, was a preoccupation of this earlier period by a lot of folks, including George Washington himself. George Washington made many expeditions into this Ohio country. This is a map that he made during his 1753-1754 expedition to go politely ask the French to leave. Didn't go well, but I'm not sure they thought it would. And then, of course, the Evans map, most famously, is sort of the de facto, the statement of what we know about this West area in this earlier period. However, it is not, the Evans map is fantastic. It is groundbreaking. It is landmark, but it gets less and less accurate the further west you go. And it was very clear pretty early on that it was not going to do for the kinds of more detailed needs of folks in this post-war moment. We're talking about people who want to better control this area, and to control this area, they need geographical information. They need better ideas of where are the rivers, what do they connect to, where do they go, what's the easiest way to get in here, what kind of resources are available, where are indigenous people living? And the Evans map can answer some of those questions, but not all of them. And that's really where the Hutchins map is coming from. One of the big differences that you'll notice here, first of all, is that in the Evans map, you have the coast, right? It's a view of Eastern North America, but you have this coastal area. Hutchins map, no. This is a purely interior map. And just to give you a better sense, to orient yourself about what area we're looking at, this is it sort of geo-referenced over a modern map. This is done, just to shout out ARGO again, we have a geo-referencing feature available through allmaps.org, and this is what that display looks like. So if you're on ARGO, many of our maps, you can click through and see them superimposed over a modern map. So yeah, again, we're talking about this area in the interior, but not like the deep interior. Again, we're not in Colorado, we're not in Montana, but we are in an area where British settlers and most British people had not been before, had not even considered before. So let's talk a little bit about Thomas Hutchins himself. Thomas Hutchins is born in 1730 in New Jersey. So he is a colonist. He is an American. He's born in Monmouth County. He, very young, moves to what was then the frontier in Western Pennsylvania. He joins the military very young. He is active in the 7 Years' War. He is with the group of folks that are there when Fort Duquesne falls, which then becomes Fort Pitt, which then becomes Pittsburgh. And he is a military engineer. So that means that he is responsible for helping to build military works and also a lot of surveying, mapping work. So he starts this very young. After the 7 Years' War, he joins the British military as an engineer, and he goes on a number of these sort of mapping, quasi-military mapping expeditions that map I showed you earlier was demonstrating. I have this picture here primarily because we do not have a portrait of him, and this has his name, so that is the next best thing. But it is also an example of some of the survey work that he was doing. As an example of some of the other things that he was up to, he was with Henry Bouquet in the expedition against Pontiac's rebellion immediately after the 7 Years' War. So this is a moment where an alliance of indigenous people, after the French are defeated, reacting to mistreatment from the British, as well as their own concerns over the future of their homelands, rise up, attack the British. Thomas Hutchins is there as part of with Bouquet's men on this expedition to put down that uprising. And he produces a number of maps. So all of our sort of best and most famous maps of that expedition are all done by Thomas Hutchins. He is also involved in a kind of incredible expedition following the route shown on the Hutchins map itself, all the way down the Ohio from Fort Pitt, and then down the Mississippi, and then off the map, all the way down to New Orleans, and then around New Orleans, around Florida, and then to Havana, this is in 1766, which that is a heck of a trip. Which is all to say that the information on the Hutchins map, unlike something like a Mitchell map or some other maps that we'll talk about, which are more of a compilation of other people's work, a great deal of the Hutchins map is based on on-the-ground survey work done by Hutchins himself. A lot of this is taken from his own work, from his own notes. He does credit Evans for a lot of the material to the east, so he is sort of directly building off of Evans. But for the stuff in the west, a lot of this is just coming from himself. And then this is an example of one of these that is part of the River Ohio that he does on this 1766 expedition. And we'll come back to this a little bit later because of my own personal interest in the big bones that they find. Foreshadowing, we're going to talk about fossils. Okay. So then after all of this, so he's in the military, he has a robust military career, he's spending all of his time in this new area that everyone is suddenly very, very interested in a British context. And so he starts planning to put out a published map that's going to bring together all of this knowledge that he has, that he knows that other people want. So as early as 1772, he is actively working on getting this map out. So remember, this map isn't published until 1778. But as early as 1772, this is a newspaper advertisement from the Virginia Gazette, where he's basically saying, hey, I'm working on this really cool map. You should subscribe, which is a business model where you it's kind of like Kickstarter, right? So you try to get a lot of people to get you a little bit of money, and then you have enough money to do your expensive thing. Clearly, given the gap in time between 1772 and 1778, this is not wildly successful. He does solicit Washington, among other people, and as far as I can tell, Washington did not actually subscribe to this map. He does purchase it later, and I would kind of like to be wrong because it seems like something he would subscribe to, but I couldn't find any record of it. Benjamin Franklin does subscribe, but I think Benjamin Franklin subscribes to like everything you put in front of him, so maybe some light Ben Franklin slander. But it does eventually come out. And in the interim, he goes on more expeditions, he gathers more information. And when the map is published, he says that it's based on information up to and including trips from 1775. So he stays working. When he publishes the map, he publishes it alongside this pamphlet. So this picture is from the library's copy. As I mentioned, we have the French version of it on display. The British version, the binding is a little bit too tight, so we made the decision that it wouldn't be good to display it. But what this pamphlet does, and the pamphlet is called, and this is I put down the shorter title. I should have put down the full title, which is like the entire title page, is a topographical description of Virginia, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and North Carolina. It's meant to be read in tandem with looking at the map. It explains some of his sources, some of his impetus for creating the map, and it also serves as a very detailed description of the land. He tells you about the soil. He tells you about the animals, a lot of buffaloes. There used to be buffaloes that far east. He tells you about, there's a lot of coal. He talks about a coal mine caught on fire and it burned for like 5 days, but it's still full of coal. Oh my God, so much coal. And it really, when you read it, you get the sense, and this is a sense you can get from looking at the map as well. But what's going on here is that this is a powerful argument for settling this area, right? For going in there, for bringing it into the British settler world. He's imagining towns, he's imagining farms, he's imagining a world in which the people who are living in the eastern part of North America are going to move into this western interior. That was not an opinion that was shared, especially at the imperial level. I'm not going to get into it, but if any of you are familiar with the proclamation line of 1763, this is a moment also where the British imperial powers that be draw a line down the middle of the Appalachian Mountains and they say, we're going to keep settlers on this side of the line, and then this side of the line is going to be for indigenous people. It is a cynical move. It is not necessarily a pro-indigenous people move, but it is one that is meant to restrict settler expansion, and that is clearly not a vision that Hutchins shares. Hutchins sees this as an area of action. So I have a couple of fun quotes from in here, where he's really enthusiastic about Ohio. So if anyone here is from Ohio, Hutchins has your back, and Illinois for that matter. But for example here, and this is very typical, he's talking about what's all in the map. So he says, this map comprehends this huge amount of territory, and for healthfulness, fertility of soil, and variety of productions, it is not perhaps surpassed by any on the habitable globe. This is I can't imagine a stronger statement in favor of the benefits of this area. And then he also sort of goes into detail. This is where he's talking more about the Ohio portion, because this is sort of, he conceptually divides this up into the Illinois country and the Ohio country. Illinois country is kind of the part in green, and the Ohio country is most of the rest of it. And then there's also sort of a lower part that he talks about a bit. But especially when he's talking about the Ohio country, he says, among other things, that no part of the globe is blessed with a more healthful air or climate. And it's basically, you can grow anything you want. If you cough and spill some seeds on the ground, they're going to sprout up, knee high by the 4th of July. And, it's this beautiful, rich, incredible country. And you don't even need to work that hard. And he says, it contains at least 1 million of square miles, and it may with truth be affirmed that no part of the globe is blessed with a more healthful air or climate, water with more navigable rivers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Again, he's very, very excited about this area. He sees this as a place of action, a place for people to move into, white people to move into. I wanted to highlight the 1 million square acres thing because in a great little aside, Thomas Jefferson reads this, and in a very kind of Jefferson moment, he writes Hutchins and he's like, you said 1 million square miles, but I redid your calculations and I'm pretty sure you're wrong. Appraises it back down. Hutchins writes him back and like, I'm sorry, sir, you're right, sir. That's so smart of you. But it does demonstrate that like, this is a document, this is a map. We know that Washington is very into this map, but so are a lot of the other founders. Jefferson owns it. Franklin, of course, owns it very early. This is something that would have been a central document for anybody looking to understand this western part of North America, and that includes all of our big name founders. Okay, so just a little bit aside to wrap things up. Ben Franklin is back again, of course. This isn't a dig at Ben Franklin, but I do find his ubiquity kind of amazing. I'll be like researching something where I'm like, surely there is no way that Benjamin Franklin will be involved. And then all of a sudden he's like there, jumping out of the page, like, hi, it's me. But in this story, he does play a big role. So at the time that the Hutchins map is published, it's 1778, the American Revolution has broken out. Hutchins is in London when he publishes the map. He'd gone over there in part to gin up the funds and to get it engraved properly. And he is, of course, as you'll recall, a member of the British Army and has been for most of his life, most of his career. He gets in trouble very quickly because he is a sympathizer to the American cause. He's from New Jersey. He is on the side of the Americans. He is accused of being a spy, probably correctly. He probably was acting as a spy. There's evidence he was corresponding with Franklin in France. He is thrown in prison. for 7 weeks. Let me see if I can find this quote. Yes, and he complains in the pamphlet that he was, quote, loaded with irons, put among felons, and treated with every kind of severity and insult. But he is able to get out with the help of Benjamin Franklin, who is in France at this time. He gets across the channel. Franklin then is able to send him to the United States. Once he is there, he sort of joins up with the American military. He becomes the general geographer for the Southern Department. Washington kind of specifically sends him to try to make better maps of Georgia and South Carolina because he is unimpressed by the quality of maps at the time. Like I said, Washington was a map guy. He had very high standards. And eventually that position morphs into the general geographer of the United States, which, as Dr. Spear mentioned, he was the first and the only. There's other map makers, but he was the only one with that title. And he serves in that position until he dies in 1789 of a long-standing illness. The other Ben Franklin connection is, I mentioned already that there are French versions of this map, as well as the pamphlet. Ben Franklin is instrumental in that. So the French versions of Hutchins' publications are done by Georges-Louis Le Rouge, who was a very important, very prominent French map maker who had a habit of a lot of his work was republishing British maps for a French audience, and this is one of those cases. So he does a French version of the Hutchins, as you'll see if you're here in person, or if you sort of go on ARGO and you look at the dimensions. The French version is much smaller than the Hutchins version. The Hutchins version is like this by this. It's a 4-sheet. French is 1. But it is a lovely addition by all accounts. It becomes very important later to French land speculators. After the American Revolution, a lot of Frenchmen become very interested in American land. So this is the map that they're using. And it is Ben Franklin who, especially for the pamphlet, is reading the proofs. Le Rouge sends them to him. He reads through them, says, yes, this seems good. This is good. So Ben Franklin, again, plays a role here in getting these French versions of the Hutchins produced. Okay, let's move on to the main attraction. Here we are, it's George Washington's Mount Vernon. We always got to talk about our boy George. Let's talk about George Washington and the Hutchins map. So I'm going to give you 3 specific instances of Washington using the Hutchins map. But the thing I want to emphasize is that when you're thinking about the West in the 1780s, 90s, even further on, you're using the Hutchins map almost by definition. This is the first good easily available map of this Trans-Appalachian West area. So everybody who's thinking seriously about this area that gets included in the United States after 1783, they're using Hutchins. They're thinking with Hutchins. So even when, Hutchins's name doesn't show up, you got to imagine that this is the source they're going to. This is the source that they're using. But I am going to use 3 specific examples of places where George Washington did use Hutchins, and they are all post-war. The first one is that George Washington, for those of you who did not know, he was very involved in the West, and he owned a significant amount of land out in this Western area. So one of the biggest tracts that he owned was on the Great Kanawha River. So my apologies if I'm pronouncing that wrong, if anyone knows better than me. He, through grants that were owed to him for military service in the 7 Years' War, and other mechanisms, buying up other people's claims, etc., he amassed over 23,000 acres of land in this area by the early 1770s. So even before the American Revolution breaks out, Washington has this tremendous amount of land located out here in this further west area. So this image here, this is a survey of one of his Kanawha tracts from about 1774. And this is an area where it shows the Kanawha River is on the Evans map, but it's at a it's essentially useless. It doesn't tell you any information. Only the Hutchins map gives you this area in the resolution that George Washington would have needed to think about his lands. So this, you can see the area in Hutchins. So Washington's lands were sort of in between the Great and Little Kanawha rivers along the Ohio there. So he talks about, when he's talking about his land, when he's talking about going out to see his land, which he tries to do a number of times, he's always talking about the Hutchins. He's talking about, I looked at the table of distances, it says it's this far to this far. Sometimes he's correcting them because Washington loved to correct things. But it's the Hutchins specifically, and he tells us this, that he's using to think about his lands. And interestingly, it's in this context that Washington, this is part of why I'm a little bit surprised that he didn't subscribe to the map, which again, I'd love to be wrong on. He knows about Hutchins as early as 1770, when he's talking about his lands and he's using an unpublished version of things that are in the pamphlet to calculate distances. Okay. The next way that we see Washington using Hutchins is in another scheme that is not unrelated to his western lands, which is the Potomac Company, the Potomac Canal Company. So this was a long-held scheme of Washington's that he's very, very active in, especially in the 1780s, sort of in between his wartime service and his return to political service as president, where the vision is to set up the Potomac River as the channel of commerce from everything that's happening in this western area. So the fur trade around the Great Lakes, everything that's being produced in these regions, channeling it down through the Potomac River to the rest, to the more settled areas of the country. This is his vision. So the Potomac Canal Company that he creates is meant to create improvements on the Potomac River, which they do to a limited degree. They are especially around the area around Georgetown and Harper's Ferry. But again, he is using Hutchins to make the argument for why the Potomac is the best river. There is a little bit in this of where, like, of course, Washington thinks the Potomac is the best river because, like, if you look over there, the Potomac is there, and then we're at his house. So, like, this is not entirely, like, super high-minded, but when he's making the argument that, you know, it should be the Potomac, it shouldn't be any of the rivers that go through, you know, God forbid, Pennsylvania, he is looking at the Hutchins to make that argument. And he's especially looking at the pamphlet. So as you can see here, he's writing to Benjamin Harrison, and he's specifically invoking Hutchins as saying that, like, I'm not the only person that thinks the Potomac is the best way to channel all of this wealth. Hutchins says so too. So does Evans. So again, this is another way where he's marshaling Hutchins to make this argument for him. And then finally, the last example I want to give you, and this is more sort of broader, where Washington is thinking about big vision plans for how the United States is going to incorporate this Western territory. This is a small example, but it speaks to big things, which is this idea of, like, what is the infrastructure that we need in this American state to control this region? So I just put up a great quote here because I really like it, and I kind of wish I had it when I was writing my dissertation. Oh well, so sad, too bad for me, where he says, writing to Richard Henry Lee, "The spirit of emigration is great. People have got impatient, and though you cannot stop the road, it is yet in your power to mark the way." So what he's saying is, we can't stop all of these white settlers from flooding into this western area, you know, causing huge problems with indigenous people, causing all kinds of tensions and problems that we don't want to deal with. We can't stop it. We don't necessarily want to stop it. What we can do is we can control it, we can shape it, we can funnel it. And in this letter also, he is talking about where he thinks that they should be building new posts. So trade posts, places for the military that can help serve this purpose of marking the way, if you will. And you get the sense that he's literally sitting there, you know, in his study, in his library. He's got the Hutchins out, he's looking at the Hutchins, and he's writing these letters. Because he specifically says that, you know, I'm looking at the Hutchins right now, Richard Henry Lee, and I think the best place that we could put a fort is in the spot here, on the Hutchins at the Miami Village, which does raise all kind of questions, like if it's still an indigenous village, does not actually seem like a great place to put a post. But he says this repeatedly. It's clear that he's studied this map. He's thought about the river systems going through. So part of the justification for this, and I think probably part of the reason why the Miami have a settlement there, is that you can see these two rivers kind of come down here from the two lakes, and they meet there. And then you can see Detroit, which at this point, the British are occupying Detroit. That this is an area where if we put a post here, if we man it with U.S. military and others, this is one place where we can really effectively control the situation in the West. And again, he's using the Hutchins, which is to belabor the point a little bit, but the point is this map is tremendously important for thinking about the American Near West, for thinking about in this moment after the American Revolution. The Treaty of Paris 1783 has attached to the United States everything east of the Mississippi. What do we practically do with that? How can we manage that situation? And when people are thinking about that, as well as thinking about, well, okay, how can this benefit my bottom line? You know, maybe I can make some money here on lands. For both of those questions, Hutchins is the map that they're going to. All right. So as we're getting sort of winding up a little bit, because I want to make sure to leave lots of time for questions, I want to talk a little bit about some of the details of this map. I like to do this because it's really easy to either get lost in the details or simply only think about the big picture. So I want to end with just a few little spots that I just want to call your attention to, some little details in the map that tell us something about the Hutchins, and also cool fossils of mammoths. Or mastodons, I guess, actually, technically, which is a spoiler for the first one, which is this area here. So as you'll see, I have put both the published Hutchins and the manuscript survey of the Ohio that he did. And in both cases, you will see a notation, big bones. And then over here, let's see if I can get this right. I think it says, yeah, which does it show here? Yeah, elephant bones found in this lick. Yeah. So in both cases, and it's interesting that it stays in the published map because he takes off a lot of these smaller notations, as you can see on his survey map. But it is important to remind the people about the big bones that are there. And so what this is referring to, I'm going to skip forward twice here, is what is today Big Bone Lick State Historic Site in Kentucky. So this is still there. I would desperately love to go there someday. It is originally it was a landscape of a salt lick and marsh where there was a very high number of large animal fossils that were just kind of sitting on the surface of the area in a very remarkable way. This was well known to the indigenous population that lived there. They told Europeans about it. They were like, hey, there's these giant bones. There are stories of some early explorers of as far back as 1729. A Frenchman goes there and sees the big bones at Big Bone, which I just love that it's just called Big Bone Lick. It's like, what are we going to call it? We got some big bones here. What about Big Bone? All right. But interestingly enough, it's this 1766 expedition that Hutchins is on that creates this survey, which as far as I was able to tell in some of my admittedly not super deep research, that results in actual fossils from this site being kind of disseminated into the wider European scientific community. So George Crowan, who is with, I believe it's George Crowan, it's either him or Harry Gordon, who is with Thomas Hutchins on this expedition, collects a bunch of bones and gives them to, of course, Benjamin Franklin, who else, to examine them. And so in many ways, this is, and you'll see on the sign, it says it's the birthplace of American vertebrate paleontology, which is not the catchiest slogan necessarily. I think we could workshop that a little bit, but it is a tremendously important site for thinking about the sort of deep ancient past of North America, as well as, again, the birth of the entire field of paleontology. And so the Hutchins map has something to tell us about that. This is a quote from the pamphlet, which I do like. It's at the head of a small creek or run where are several large and miry salt springs are found numbers of large bones, teeth, and tusks, commonly supposed to be that of elephants. But the celebrated Dr. Hunter of London, in his ingenious and curious observations on these bones, etc., has supposed them to belong to some carnivorous animal, larger than an ordinary elephant. Which I do love, because then we just have this vision of this gigantic meat-eating elephant that's like running around North America, just like attacking folks, eating deer. So as you can tell, we're very early days here. No one knows what to make of these bones. But I just find this kind of a fun aside that this story gives us some insight into, this map gives us some insight into. All right. The other one is this. Is there anyone here from Indiana? Does this look like Indiana to you? No, yes. Good answer. In fact, this is very unlike Indiana. It is in the wrong place as well as the wrong shape. And yet here is this strange little orange spot in this map labeled Indiana. What's going on here? So what this is, and you'll see this is mostly located in what's now West Virginia. So again, definitely not Indiana. What this is a reference to one of my favorite failed colonies, which is Vandalia. Has anyone heard of Vandalia? Okay, good. Got some Vandalia fans in the audience. I love to see that. So Vandalia, of which Indiana was part, was a proposed colony in the 1760s that was put forward by a number of sort of traders in the area, so folks that traded with indigenous people, as well as people who were very interested in land speculation and large land claims. And their plan was to create the first interior colony, the first British colony that did not have a connection to the ocean. So they get this Indiana grant initially as compensation from the Haudenosaunee people for things that were lost during the war. It's kind of a complicated story. They get this grant. They go to London and they say, hey, Board of Trade, who governs this, we have this great idea for an interior colony. And it did not go well. The Board of Trade is very upset. They say, no, if you have an interior colony, you're going to stop trading with the mother country. You're going to become independent. You're going to be like making manufactures, which is the worst thing anybody can do. Absolutely not. No, next. It never gets off the ground. And then after the American Revolution, they lose these land claims entirely because this area is decreed to be part of Virginia, and then Virginia sort of gives up all of its previous claims in this area as part of the settlement. So what we have here is this weird little phantom hangover. It does this thing that I love when maps do, which it like very confidently shows you something. And if you're not paying attention, you're like, oh yeah, of course, Indiana, that's right, that exists. But this was never anything at all. This didn't exist for all intents and purposes, and yet it lives on in this incredibly widely circulated, incredibly important map, kind of punching way above its weight, which I find very interesting and very fun. So yeah, if anyone ever asks you where Indiana is, do consider it a trick question. Okay, and then finally, this is some more stuff just to demonstrate again the way in which Hutchins is thinking of his map and of his work, and way the map is taken to be kind of a manifesto for settling the West, for settling the Trans-Appalachian West, rather than just describing it. So this is a great quote here with the area that references, which is, Cuyahoga furnishes the best portage between Ohio and Lake Erie. At its mouth, it is wide and deep enough to receive large sloops from a lake. It will hereafter be a place of great importance. Question for the audience, was he right? Do we know what happened in this spot? Cleveland, thank you, it's Cleveland. So yeah, in a sense that he is right. And again, this is very clearly, this will be a place of importance. He is imagining Cleveland, is what he's doing in this passage. This close-up also gives you a sense of the ways in which he is filling the map with this kind of practical information for folks who are interested in buying land, who are interested in settling land. This is also a map that gets heavily used by land speculators, and you can see why, because he adds all these additional notations, right? So he's got like, level rich land. I think in one of the previous ones, you can see where he's pointed out coal deposits. Where I just went in my own work. I am going to walk over, but I won't talk, I promise. Yeah, I will talk a little. You can see freestone, coals. So he's annotating the map with resources that can be exploited, that can be used. All right, so that is maybe a little bit of an anticlimactic end, but we are at the end. So that has been my journey with you through the Thomas Hutchins map. As Dr. Sparrow mentioned, in June, I have another one of these coming up. We're going to be talking about the Montresor map of New York City, talking again about sort of mapping during the Imperial crisis era. This is going to crib heavily off of a presentation I did with Richard Brown, so I'm going to give Richard co-author credit for many parts of that. And then I have two other talks coming up in the fall, September 19th and November 21st. Topics to be announced, although I am pretty sure that what we're going to do for those is we're going to talk about those big parliamentary British funded surveys, which are big epic tales that involve, map makers who are also mystics, people running away from their mistresses, getting lost in swamps, all these kinds of things. So I think that's where we're going to go with our fall talks. But that wraps it up. Thank you all so much for coming today. And yeah, we have some time for questions before you can go and take a look at the actual map itself. Thank you. And yes, please do speak into the microphone. It's less for the people in the room and more for the folks that are on the stream at home.
Okay. As unused as I am to public speaking. So you showed us the approximate size of the maps, which is considerably smaller than the projection on the screen. And the projection on the screen had a lot of very tiny writing. What did people do to be able to read that little tiny writing? And did most men have good penmanship in those days? Generally men don't have good handwriting.
Oh gosh, I would love to say that everyone had better handwriting back then, but unfortunately, I've read some really awful handwriting from the 18th century. I will say that there were more people, like people who were professionals, either had folks who were specifically trained in good, clear handwriting or developed good, clear handwriting themselves. So it would have been a much more common skill than it is today among folks that could write. In terms of reading it, it's relatively legible depending on your light source. You'll be able to see when you see the original. And people also did have lenses at this time, so you could do some magnifying as well. You know, you couldn't do a pinch zoom on your iPhone like we can today, but they did have methods for trying to make some of this more legible, because you're right, it is incredibly packed with detail.
I noticed one or two of the maps that said British Library.
Mhm.
Does that mean Britain owns it, or
Yeah, so one of the
and
maps.
why don't we own it?
That's a great question that I will take directly to the British Library. No, so a lot of the maps that were part of my presentation, and generally, so even if all of the maps started out as being owned by Thomas Hutchins, they are now very dispersed. So the William L. Clements Library in Michigan has a number of Thomas Hutchins manuscripts. British Library has some, as you very eagle-eyed viewers point out. And this is actually lets me pitch ARGO directly, because one of the really nice things about ARGO is that it is multi-institutional. So all the maps I use are part of that platform. So even though they are divided up physically, we can reunite them digitally. And that is just because in that case, the British Library has it because it was part of a report that was sent back to the British government. Because again, remember, he is in the British Army at this point. So when he's making reports, he's sending them to Britain. He's not sending them to like Ben Franklin necessarily.
And where did George Washington, because you said he acquired like around 20,000 acres around Ohio, did he use Martha Washington's money to buy this land?
That's a good question. I'm going to say probably he used Martha Washington's money to buy most things. He was, yeah. So he acquired some of the lands. So basically in the 7 Years' War, if you were at a certain rank in the military, one of the ways they rewarded you for your service was with land. So he has claims based on his military service, but then he also buys up other people's claims. So it's a combination of both like things that were owed to him for his military service and him kind of wheeler dealing with his buddies, acquiring additional lands, where I do think Martha probably came in handy there. Yeah.
Kind of two related questions. How long did it take him to do these surveys? Because if you look at that map, especially just like around the Bone place, if he actually surveyed all the various outcroppings going down the Kanawha River, in other words, it seems like it would take a long time. And the second, in view of the issue with the Native Americans, how many people were with him, and did he have any trouble with people attacking him, or, you know, was his health in danger during the time he's going up and down everywhere?
Yeah. I mean, to answer your second question first, I have not, I probably should have done a thorough review of all of his different expeditions, but generally speaking, well, we're talking about going into these really interior areas. They are claimed by the British, but practically speaking, they are indigenous homelands, right? Like they are the ones that are living there. They are the ones that know the land. They don't need to send a guy to survey it because they've been living there for generations. They know the land. So it was very much, even if you know, you can put it as red as you want on your map, but you need to go in either with somebody who can vouch for you, who can guide you, who can act as an indigenous guide for you, or you are, you know, risking your life. And my sense is that certainly things kind of went both ways. So George Crowan, who was on the 1766 expedition, I think the previous year he had been down the Ohio doing some stuff, and he was captured by indigenous people and held for a time. So I don't know if, I mean, certainly during the 7 Years' War, Hutchins would have been in armed conflict with various indigenous groups as well as allied with certain indigenous groups. But I think it's important to remember that this is a region where If you're going to go in there and you're going to be doing surveying, you need to have an arrangement with the locals, with the people that actually live there, and that's the indigenous people who live there. And I'm blanking with what your first question was.
How long did it take him?
Oh yeah,
Like he showed the Ohio,
yeah,
but then you have the Mississippi.
yeah. And there are manuscript surveys that he does of the Mississippi and the Ohio one. That is a very small portion of that map. It is basically, it's the Ohio from Fort Pitt, I think all the way down to where it meets the Mississippi. So it is very detailed, very big. My understanding of how this generally worked is that as you're going down, you are making the calculations. You're taking the measurements. You're doing much more trigonometry than I personally am comfortable with. And then it's only later, so you start with like a notebook that has a lot of recorded information in it and maybe some quick sketches. But then it's later when you have the time that you take those notations and that information and the mathematical equations and the numbers, and you turn that into something visual. So a map like the manuscript ones that I was showing, they're not something he was doing as they were, on a boat down the Ohio. They're something that he would have done later on when he was back home. But the short answer is it took a long time.
Well, he must have been starting in 1770, right? Already trying to.
Yeah. Yeah, no, he definitely had some kind of a draft by 1772. He clearly, I wish we had that draft. As far as I know, we don't, but yeah. So this is something that he was definitely like working on continuously from the 1760s until it gets published in 1778.
At the risk of asking you a question that nobody knows the answer to.
Oh no.
But he's often, Hutchins often described as the first geographer of the United States. This was done by the Continental Congress, I think, and it's unusual that the Articles of Confederation, operating underneath that they're actually employing.
That they're doing anything at
yeah,
all.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, of course, it's focused on the West, which is the one thing that Congress is able to really succeed at, is taking a little bit more control of the West and having a plan and so forth. But in any case, do you have any idea who was giving him direction? How was he getting paid? Was he getting paid? What was he actually doing as geographer? Or was it simply a title and he was just going about his business as usual?
One of the big things that he does is that he surveys the 7 ranges of townships in Ohio. That seems to have taken up a lot of his time during this period. So the 7 ranges are part of the modern state of Ohio that are set aside very early on post-revolution, where they're sort of like, these are areas where we're going to be giving land to soldiers and for other purposes. So he is responsible for those surveys. He kind of sets the pattern for township surveying in the New Republic. So he's very influential in that way. So my sense is he's certainly working. He's working very hard. He's about to go do a survey down the Mississippi again when he dies. Did he get paid? That's a great question. I kind of hope he did, but also knowing the Continental Congress, I don't know if he did. Yes, I don't know if that satisfactorily answers your question, but I think definitely his position is an artifact of, as you said, that the West was the one thing everyone could agree on, that we knew we want to do something in the West. We want to settle the West. We want to control the West. So at the very least, we can agree on that. We can send Hutchins out there and have him do some stuff on the ground.
Great, that's great. Well, I want to ask everybody to give all another great round of applause.
Thank you.
For our next lunch to the library, and of course, June the 7th for Alla's next talk here. But before that, as Alla mentioned, we have pulled out examples of the Hutchins map for everybody to see if they have time and are able to. And Alla, I don't know if you want to give a little bit of instruction how they should do it or where.
Down the hall to your right. There'll be an open door and you should see it right there. Great. Thank you all so much for coming.